A whip cracked against bone. A starving Mustang flinched at the hitching rail and tried to lift his head. The trader cracked the whip again, and the horse staggered into the post. An old cowboy stepped out of the trading post with a sack of flour on his shoulder. He set the sack on the boardwalk. He walked across the dust toward the rail. He laid one hand flat on the Mustang's neck. He stood between the horse and the trader without raising his voice. He said, "How much?" The trader said, $10 cash. The cowboy unhooked something from inside his vest pocket. He laid it on the wood counter inside. The trader laughed when he saw it. Then he stopped laughing. The trader took the deal. What the Mustang dug up 2 days later is why I am telling you this story. Stay with me on this one. The trading post sat at the edge of a one-street town called Cottonwood Bend. The year was 1882. The town had a saloon, a livery, a sheriff's office no bigger than a closet, and the trading post itself, which was a long, low building made of pine boards bleached white by 20 Kansas summers. Beyond the trading post the prairie ran flat and brown all the way to the horizon. A single line of cottonwood trees marked the creek that gave the town its name. The wind moved across the open country every afternoon and lifted the dust off the road in long brown ribbons. There were not more than 30 people in town on any given day. Most of them were passing through on their way to somewhere else. The old cowboy's name was Jeremiah Pace. He was 67 years old that summer, and he had ridden into Cottonwood Bend on a tired buckskin gelding to buy flour and beans for the month. His ranch sat 11 miles east, a small one-room cabin and a corral, and 40 acres of grass that nobody else had wanted to file on 20 years ago when Jeremiah had filed on it. He ran 12 head of cattle and 3 horses and a milk goat. He had never married. He had outlived 2 brothers and 3 sisters and both his parents. The only family he had left in the world was a long-lost brother named Caleb who had ridden off to join the war in '61 and had never come home. Jeremiah had spent 21 years not knowing whether Caleb was dead in a ditch in Tennessee or alive in a cabin in Oregon. He had stopped asking after a while. He had not stopped wondering. The trader's name was Hatch. Hatch was a heavy man with a thin face and a habit of cheating people who could not read. He bought horses cheap at the Army remount sale and sold them dear to ranchers and freighters who needed mounts. He had been in business in Cottonwood Bend for 6 years. The sheriff did not like him. Half the town did not like him. But Hatch had the only horseflesh for sale within 40 miles, and so people did business with him whether they liked him or not. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Hatch had tied a wild Mustang to the hitching rail in front of the trading post and put a sign on the post that said $10 cash, sound horse, broken to halter. The horse was none of those things. The horse was a starving 4-year-old wild Mustang Hatch had bought off a cattle drive crew the week before. The horse had not been broken to anything. The horse had not eaten a proper meal in 6 days. Jeremiah saw the horse the moment he stepped out of the trading post with his flour. The Mustang was a sorrel with 3 white stockings and a small white star above his eyes. His ribs showed plain through the dust on his coat. His mouth was raw at the corners from the rope Hatch had used to drag him to town. His back left hock was swollen the size of a fist. He stood with his head low, and his front feet braced apart because he was too tired to lift his head and too proud to lay down on the dirt of the street. When Jeremiah laid his hand on the Mustang's neck, the horse turned one eye toward him slow and looked at him for a long moment. The horse did not flinch. The horse did not pull away. The horse just looked. Jeremiah had been a cowboy for 50 years, and he had seen that look on a horse maybe 4 times in his life. It was the look of a horse who has decided to die and is waiting on permission to stop. Hatch came out of the trading post chewing on a wad of tobacco. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Jeremiah at the rail. He spit. He said, "You fixing to buy that animal, old-timer?" Jeremiah said, "How much?" Hatch said, $10 cash. Jeremiah said, "I have not got $10 cash, and you know it." Hatch laughed. Hatch said, "Then move along and let a real buyer have a look." Jeremiah did not move along. He stood at the rail with his hand on the Mustang's neck, and he thought for a long minute. Then he reached up under his canvas vest and unhooked the silver pocket watch his father had hung on him the morning he had ridden off to the war in 1861. It was a heavy round watch with a chain of plain silver links, and a hunter's case worn smooth on the cover from 21 years of being thumbed open and shut. Jeremiah had carried that watch through 4 years of war. He had carried it home through 3,000 miles of prairie. He had carried it through every winter and every summer on his small ranch for 2 decades. He had never spent a day of his adult life without it against his ribs. He walked into the trading post and laid the watch on the wood counter. He laid the chain beside it in a careful coil. He said, "This is a Henry Bigellin out of St. Louis." He said, "The works are good." He said, "The case is silver, and the chain is silver, and the whole rig is worth $25 in any town with a watchmaker." He said, "You take it for 10, and we are square on the Mustang." Hatch picked up the watch. He turned it over in his fat hand. He thumbed the case open. He held the watch to his ear and listened to it tick. He laughed once. He said, "Done, old man." He said, "You can have your spavin sorrel." He pocketed the watch and walked out the door behind Jeremiah and untied the Mustang from the rail and handed Jeremiah the lead rope and said, "Good luck getting him home." Jeremiah took the rope. He did not say goodbye. He walked the Mustang the 11 miles back to his cabin at a pace the horse could keep, which was a slow walk with 3 rests for water along the creek. Now here is the thing. Jeremiah Pace was a quiet cowboy. He had not cried since the day they buried his mother in 1854. He had not held a man's life in his hands since the war ended. He had ridden out of the Battle of Pea Ridge in '62 with a mini ball lodged behind his right collarbone, and the surgeon had told him afterward that an inch the other way would have killed him on the spot. He had ridden home from Appomattox in '65 with the same mini ball still in his shoulder, and a silver pocket watch ticking against his ribs, and a letter from his brother Caleb folded inside the watch case that said, "Meet me in Oregon by '67, brother, and we will start over." Caleb had never made it to Oregon. Caleb had never made it anywhere. Jeremiah had kept the letter folded inside the case of that watch for 17 years. He had taken the letter out and read it once a year on the anniversary of the day he had ridden home. He had never told a living soul what was written inside. He took the letter out of the case before he laid the watch down on Hatch's counter. He folded the letter carefully and put it in the small chest pocket of his shirt. Then he laid the watch down. He thought as he walked the Mustang home that he had given away the case, but not the contents. He thought maybe that was the deal he had made with himself a long time ago, and he had only just now noticed it. The Mustang's name was nothing yet. Jeremiah did not name a horse until he had owned it for a month. The Mustang walked the 11 miles home behind the buckskin gelding without pulling on the rope. He drank deep at the creek both times Jeremiah stopped. He nosed at a patch of green grass the second time, but he did not eat any of it. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was nearly down. Jeremiah turned the Mustang loose in the small corral behind the cabin with a forkful of good prairie hay and a bucket of clean creek water. He stood at the corral rail in the long evening light and watched the horse pick at the hay one mouthful at a time, the way a starving animal eats when it has forgotten that food is something to be trusted. He went into the cabin and built up the fire in the small iron stove. He made himself a pot of beans and a pan of biscuits. He ate his supper at the small pine table by the window where he could keep an eye on the corral. The Mustang ate his hay slow, but he ate it. By dark the horse had cleaned the forkful and was nosing at the rail for more. Jeremiah took him out a second forkful and a half a scoop of cracked corn. He stood at the rail again and watched the Mustang eat the second meal faster than the first. The horse lifted his head once and looked at Jeremiah across the rail and the dust of the corral. The look was different now. The look was not a horse waiting on permission to die. The look was a horse remembering that he had once been a horse. The second morning Jeremiah saddled the buckskin and led the Mustang out the cabin gate on a lead rope. He had it in mind to walk the horse down to the creek and let him stand in the cold water for a while to bring the swelling down in the back hock. The creek ran half a mile south of the cabin, through a stand of cottonwoods. Jeremiah had walked it 10,000 times in 20 years. He knew every cut bank and every gravel bar by heart. He led the Mustang down the cattle trail at an easy pace. The buckskin gelding led the way, and the Mustang followed at the rope. The horse was still walking stiff on the back hock, but he was walking. That was something. When they reached the creek, the Mustang did not go to the water the way Jeremiah expected. The horse stopped at the top of the bank 20 feet short of the creek, and stood with his head up and his ears pricked forward. He looked across the gravel bar to the far side of the creek, where a low cut bank ran for 30 feet beneath an old cottonwood. He stood for a long minute. Then he started forward at a faster walk than Jeremiah had seen him manage yet. He waded the creek without stopping to drink. He came up on the far gravel bar, dripping wet. He walked straight to the cut bank under the cottonwood, and he started pawing at the dirt with his good front hoof. Jeremiah crossed the creek behind him on the buckskin. He sat the saddle for a long minute and watched the Mustang dig. The horse was not panicking. He was not bucking. He was digging the way a working cowboy's stock horse digs at the snow in winter to find the grass underneath. He pawed the dirt in steady, deliberate strokes. He moved a foot of soil in less than a minute. He stopped to nose at what he had uncovered. He pawed again. After 3 minutes of this, Jeremiah saw something dull and dark in the loose dirt. He swung down off the buckskin and walked over. It was a leather saddlebag. It had been buried under 2 feet of bank dirt and roots. The leather was almost black with age. The strap was rotten through. Jeremiah lifted it out of the hole with both hands. The Mustang stood beside him with his head down to the dirt and his nostrils working. Jeremiah carried the saddlebag up to the bank and sat down with it across his knees. He cut the rotten strap with his pocket knife. He lifted the flap. Inside the bag was a flat tin box wrapped in oilcloth and a folded piece of yellowed paper. He opened the tin first. Inside the tin, packed in a square of soft wool, was a silver pocket watch. The case was the twin of the watch he had laid on Hatch's counter the day before. Hunter case, plain silver chain, Henry Bigellin out of St. Louis. Jeremiah thumbed the case open. The works did not tick. They had stopped a long time ago. Engraved inside the cover were 3 letters and a date. CP 1859. Caleb Pace 1859. The watch their father had given Caleb the same day he had given Jeremiah his own. The pair. Jeremiah sat for a long time on the bank with the watch in his hand and the Mustang standing over him. He picked up the folded paper next. He unfolded it slow because the creases were brittle. The paper was a faded photograph cut to fit inside an envelope. Caleb stood in the picture wearing a town suit and a flat-brimmed hat. Caleb was not alone. He had his arm around a young woman in a cotton dress, and behind them stood a small log cabin with a sorrel mare tied to the porch rail. The mare in the picture had 3 white stockings and a small white star above her eyes. Jeremiah looked at the mare in the picture for a long minute. He looked at the Mustang standing over him. He looked at the picture again. Then he laid the photograph down on his knee, and he sat by the creek for a long time, and the wind moved the cottonwood leaves above his head. If you are still with me, hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you want more stories about cowboys and old horses and brothers who finally come home. Now let me tell you what came next. The Mustang in front of Jeremiah was not the mare in the picture. The mare in the picture would have been 40 years old by now, and she had been a full-grown horse already in the photograph. But the Mustang in front of him was that mare's grandson or great-grandson, and the same line of blood was running through him as plain as the small white star above his eyes. Jeremiah turned the photograph over. On the back, in pencil that had faded almost to nothing, was written one line. Brother, if you are reading this, I am 12 miles east of Cottonwood Bend on the Solomon River. Come on, brother. Caleb. Jeremiah stood up. He folded the photograph back into its creases. He put it in the chest pocket of his shirt, next to the letter he had taken out of his own watch the day before. He picked up Caleb's watch and slipped it into the inside pocket of his vest, where his own watch had ridden for 21 years. He swung up onto the buckskin, and he led the Mustang back across the creek and up the bank and home to the cabin. He did not sleep that night. He sat at the small pine table by the window, and he read the letter from inside his own watch, and he read the line on the back of the photograph, and he ate a cold biscuit, and he watched the Mustang in the corral move slow under the moon. There's a thing that happens to a cowboy who has lived alone for a long time on the prairie. He gets used to the sound of his own voice in an empty cabin. He gets used to talking to his horses because they are the only company he keeps. He stops expecting any kind of word to come back to him from the world. Jeremiah Pace had been that kind of cowboy for 21 years. He had ridden home from the war in 1865, and he had filed on his 40 acres in 66, and he had spent every single year since then alone in a one-room cabin with the prairie wind for a neighbor and his own breath for a friend. He had not been a bitter man about it. He had not been a sad man about it. He had just been a man who had outlasted his own family and gone on doing the daily chores of staying alive, because the chores were what was in front of him every morning. The letter inside his pocket watch had been the only thing that ever reminded him there had been another way his life might have gone. The letter had named Oregon, but Caleb had not made it past the South Fork of the Solomon. The letter had named 1867, but Caleb had been dead by the spring of 71 when his wife and his child died with him of whatever sickness had come through the river bottoms that year. Jeremiah did not know any of that, yet on the night he sat at his pine table with the photograph on his knee. He only knew that the Mustang in his corral had carried him to a piece of his own life. He had been missing for 2 decades. That was enough to keep a man awake until first light. The next morning at first light, he saddled the buckskin and led the Mustang behind on a long rope, and he rode east. The Solomon River ran 12 miles east of Cottonwood Bend, the same way Caleb had ridden. Jeremiah had ridden along the South Fork of the Solomon 100 times in his 20 years on the prairie. He had never thought to look for a cabin on it. There had never been any reason to look. He rode the cattle trail east at a steady walk through the morning. The Mustang followed without pulling. The day warmed. The prairie wind picked up off the foothills and bent the sage low to the ground. By noon, Jeremiah was on the banks of the Solomon. He turned the buckskin upstream. He rode for an hour along the south bank. The river curved north and ran through a stand of cottonwoods. On the far side of the cottonwoods stood a small one-room log cabin with a sagging porch and a stone chimney still standing, and a corral fence half collapsed. There was no smoke from the chimney. There was no horse in the corral. Jeremiah forded the river and rode up to the cabin gate. He swung down. He let the buckskin and the Mustang stand in the dirt yard, while he walked up the porch and pushed the door open with his shoulder. The cabin was empty. The cabin had been empty for a long time. The bunk in the corner was made up with a wool blanket that had gone moth-eaten. The small pine table by the window was set with a tin plate and a tin cup and a folded napkin, the way a man sets a table when he expects company. Above the table, on a nail in the log wall, hung a faded photograph in a tin frame. The photograph was the same picture Jeremiah carried, folded in his shirt pocket. Caleb, the woman, the sorrel mare, the cabin behind them. The same cabin Jeremiah was standing inside of right now. He sat down at the small table. He set Caleb's silver pocket watch in the center of the tin plate. He sat for a long time with his hands flat on the wood. The cabin smelled of old dust and creek water and cottonwood pollen. Through the open door, Jeremiah could see the Mustang standing in the dirt yard with his head up and his ears pricked toward the porch. The horse looked the way a horse looks when he has come home to a place he remembers from a long time ago. He sat at that table for the better part of an hour. The Mustang walked up onto the porch on his own at some point and put his head through the open doorway and stood there breathing soft against the door frame. Jeremiah looked up and saw the horse and did not say anything for a long minute. Then he reached out and laid his hand on the horse's jaw and said your grandmother brought my brother here. The Mustang did not pull away. The Mustang lowered his head and laid his chin on Jeremiah's knee. Jeremiah sat there with the horse's chin in his lap, the way a man sits with a dog when the dog is the only one in the room who understands what is happening. He felt the watch ticking in his vest pocket. He felt the photograph crinkled inside his shirt pocket. He felt the wood of the small table under his other hand. He felt 21 years of his own life finally lay itself down and quit running. Jeremiah found Caleb's grave a quarter-mile west of the cabin, on a small rise above the river. There was a flat sandstone marker with one word chiseled into it. Caleb. No date. No surname. Just the one word. There were two other markers beside it. One said Sarah, 1848 to 1871. The other said Joseph, 1870 to 1870. A wife and a boy who had not lived a year. Jeremiah sat down on the grass beside the markers. He took Caleb's letter out of his own pocket and read it one more time. He took the photograph out and looked at it one more time. He took Caleb's watch out and wound the works back into life with his thumb. The watch began to tick. It ticked steady. It ticked the same beat as the watch Jeremiah had laid on Hatch's counter the day before. The same beat exactly. The two watches had always kept the same time, because their father had wound them on the same morning before he gave one to each son. Jeremiah rode back to his cabin that night with the Mustang at the lead rope, and a piece of his life finally settled. The next morning at first light, he rode into Cottonwood Bend on the buckskin with the Mustang on the lead, and walked into the trading post and laid $100 cash on Hatch's counter. He had gone into the bank in town first and drawn the money from the small account he kept against bad winters. He said, Hatch, I am buying my watch back. He said this is $100 in good federal currency. He said you will hand the watch over and you will not argue. Hatch looked at the money. Hatch looked at the cowboy standing across the counter. Hatch handed the watch back without a word. Jeremiah slipped his own watch into his vest pocket next to Caleb's. He walked out of the trading post. He rode the Mustang home that day instead of the buckskin. The horse carried him the 11 miles at a steady walk and never lifted a foot wrong. Jeremiah named him Caleb that night at the corral rail by the light of a tin lantern. The Mustang nosed at his hand when he said the name. The Mustang knew the name. The Mustang had probably known the name since the day his grandmother had carried Caleb across these same prairies in 1862. The sheriff in Cottonwood Bend heard about the watch trade by the end of the week. The sheriff was a short, barrel-chested man named Otis Burrell, who had been at his job for 9 years and had wanted to run Hatch out of the county for 7 of them. Otis rode out to Jeremiah's cabin on a Sunday afternoon and sat on the porch step with his cowboy hat on his knee and asked Jeremiah for the whole story straight. Jeremiah told him. He laid both watches on the porch boards between them. He showed Otis the photograph and the letter. Otis sat for a long minute. Then Otis said, I am riding back to town today, and I am pulling Hatch's trader license at the county clerk's office in the morning. He said a man who whips a starving horse at a public rail is a man who needs to find a new line of work. Otis stood up and tipped his cowboy hat and rode back to town in the long evening light. Hatch lost his license that Tuesday. He left Cottonwood Bend the following Friday on the stage. Nobody in town was sorry to see him go. The hitching rail in front of the trading post sat empty for the rest of that summer, because the new owner of the post would not buy or sell a single horse out of respect for the old cowboy and his Mustang. Jeremiah Pace lived another 17 years on his small ranch, 11 miles east of Cottonwood Bend. He carried 2 silver pocket watches in his vest pocket for the rest of his life, one on each side, both keeping the same time. He rode the Mustang Caleb every fair day from the spring of 1882 until the fall of 1899, when the horse laid down in the corral at 21 years of age and did not get up. Jeremiah buried him under a cottonwood on the south bank of the creek, where the saddlebag had been dug up. He set a flat sandstone marker over the grave with one word chiseled into it. Caleb. No date. No surname. Just the one word. The way a brother marks the spot where a brother finally comes home. When Jeremiah himself died in the winter of 1901, the small ranch went to a cousin out of Missouri who had never set foot in Kansas in his life. The cousin sold the cabin and the corral and the 40 acres of grass to a neighboring rancher for cash. The cousin shipped Jeremiah's effects east in a single small wooden trunk. Inside the trunk were 2 silver pocket watches on plain silver chains, a faded photograph of a man and a woman and a sorrel mare, and a letter dated 1865 from one brother to another that ended with the words, "Come on, brother." The cousin in Missouri did not understand any of it. He sold the watches at auction for $40 apiece. He threw the photograph and the letter into the cook stove. But there are stories that do not need a written record to keep them alive. They get told around campfires by cowboys who heard them from cowboys, who heard them from the men who lived them. This story is one of those. So when you hear somebody complain that the world does not work the way it ought to, that brothers lose each other in wars and never find each other again, that quiet men hand over the only thing they own without expecting anything back, that starving horses get whipped at hitching rails by men who deserve worse than they get, remember that sometimes the prairie itself remembers a thing. Sometimes a creek bank holds a saddlebag for 20 years waiting on the right horse to dig it up. Sometimes the great-grandson of a sorrel mare leads an old cowboy across a river to a cabin where his brother set the table for him in 1870 and never got to come home. Sometimes a silver pocket watch finds its twin again on the same vest pocket after 2 decades apart. Sometimes the prairie wind carries a man's voice back to him from across a long, quiet country. Stay with the horses. They know the way.